We're starting a new series today. You may have seen, for those of you that are on the WhatsApp, we're looking at this thing about we haven't come this far to only come this far. When you hear that, you might think, here we go again. She's going to push us into doing something we don't want to do. More change. Well, I promise you it's not about that, but it is about pressing in, digging deeper and coming closer to God. So I'm quite excited to bring that to you this morning. And if you're visiting us, it's a really good morning to come and join us, because you're not going to leap into the middle of a service or series that you know nothing about. You're going to hear the first of something that we're going to be looking at for the next 8 weeks together. So it's a good time to join us, and you're really very welcome. At the start of the year, we had a conference for all the local leaders, particularly in Seba, so in this area. And during that time, I had the opportunity to walk up Beachy Head. And if you've ever done that, you'll know that it's not a gentle stroll. It's really, really steep. And actually, it had been raining that morning, and so it was quite slippy as well, because I hadn't really gone prepared to hike, so I had just like little pair of slippy trainers on, and as I started to climb, I thought, oh, maybe this is a bit of a silly idea. And then the further I got up, I was thinking, God, this is really hard work, and it was really windy, and the wind was blowing straight at me, and I was thinking, oh, why am I doing this? And so I got halfway, and I stood there for a moment, caught my breath, and as I turned around, I looked and thought, wow, the view is amazing from up here. It looked awesome. And I thought in that moment, actually, maybe I've gone high enough. Maybe this will do. Maybe I'll just rest here for a minute and then walk back down. And as I took in the view, I looked around me and I saw this other path that was actually going around the cliff edge, not so vertical, but, kind of flat, and looked really pretty and inviting. And the sun was shining on it. And I thought, oh, maybe I'll take that route rather than just going on up the hill. But then as I looked at that route a little harder, I was quite able to see that actually that was going to take me much longer than the path that I was meant to be on. Actually, that route had lots of turns and twists, and if you really studied it, it went down and then came back up again. And I thought, well, I've just gone up. I don't want to go down and then have to go up again. So it's actually, maybe it's not as inviting as I first thought. Maybe actually it's just a distraction, and I need to keep going on the path that I'm on. So I began to put one foot in front of the other, and I started going up further and further and further. And eventually, I reached the top. And all the way through the conference, we'd heard this phrase spoken to us. You haven't come this far to only come this far. And I could have stopped halfway up the hill. It was very nice, and gone back down. My legs would have been quite thankful. But I would never have reached the summit. I would never have got to where God had prompted me to walk to where he was prompting me to get to. If I'd taken the diver, it would have taken me a really long time, and I probably could have got lost and still never made it to the top of the hill. I could have been there for hours. But there was something very clear about what God was saying. He doesn't want us to get distracted. He doesn't want us to stop climbing. We have come an awful long way, haven't we, in the past few years? We've been here 5 years together now. Can you believe it already? It's gone so quick, hasn't it? And during that time, we have really built well. But I believe in this moment, in this time, that God is saying something to us fresh. I think that he's saying that we need to remember that we need to keep climbing. We need to keep pressing on. And I know when you hear that phrase, you're probably thinking, oh no, she's going to make us do more. But I don't think that's what God's saying to us in this time. I don't think that's the way he's applying it to us. I don't think it's about adding more activity or chasing unnecessary momentum. It's not even a response to something that's gone wrong because things have been going really well. What I believe that he's saying to us, what I believe he's wanting us to explore together is something far deeper than that. It's the recognition that spiritual maturity is not the same thing as spiritual completion. And that growth, even real, healthy, fruitful growth, can quietly become something we begin to settle into rather than something that continually leads us forward. I believe God is calling us on again. Because when you read scripture carefully, you begin to notice a pattern that repeats itself again and again and again. God forms his people in places he never intends them to remain in. In Israel, he formed Egypt, didn't he? But Egypt was not their home. They were shaped in the wilderness, but the wilderness was not their destination. They encounter God at the mountain, but the mountain is not where they're meant to stay. Even the early church flourishes in Jerusalem, full of life and devotion, and yet Jerusalem is not the end of the story. And again, God does something deeper and necessary in a place, something that roots and forms them and establishes his people. And then very often at the point where it begins to feel stable, and this is quite nice, he calls them beyond that. Not because the place was wrong, not because the season failed even, but because formation was never meant to be fulfillment. And I know that can feel unsettling. Because there's something in all of us that just wants to get there. We just want to arrive. It's that same, are we nearly there yet? We just want the calm, don't we? We might not say it out loud, but we feel it in quieter ways as well. Desire for things to stabilise, for things to become predictable, for the pressure to ease off just a tiny little bit. And I'll be honest, it's been quite hard. We've worked really hard, haven't we, to get where we are. We've achieved an awful lot. It would be quite nice to just put my feet up. We've come far enough, actually. It's a bit like the chocolate. We're only going to eat half of it. But Scripture constantly shows us that God doesn't lead us, his people, into static places. He leads them into deeper places, places that require trust, renewed dependence, and willingness to keep following even when it stretches us. And I want to say it again very clearly, because it does matter, because it will depict how we see the rest of this series unfolding. This isn't coming from a place of frustration. It's not correction aimed at something that's broken. Because looking back at what we've achieved, I'm so thankful to God for all that we have done. I think we're definitely out the car park. We've seen growth, haven't we? Not only in numbers, but in depth. We've seen community strengthened, leadership developed, and faith take root in ways that is real and lasting. And all of that matters. And yet, being grateful for that on its own is not the end of the story. Because it is possible to honour what God has done and still miss what he's inviting us into. It's possible to be shaped by a season and yet remain in it longer than we're meant to. And so over these next few weeks, these 8 weeks, we're going to be in a series called, well, you've probably guessed it now, You Haven't Come This Far to Only Come This Far. And we're going to explore spiritual depth and courage and what it means to keep moving with God. We're going to start with a passage in Deuteronomy, and Heather's going to come and read that for us in just a minute. And I think that God is really speaking to his people, and he says it quite simply and plainly, and yet it's still very unsettling. He says to the people of Israel, break camp, it's time to move. And everything begins to change. God meets with them not at a distance, but in a way that's visible and tangible and unmistakable. You've got the fire on the mountain, the cloud and the presence, a people who had known God as deliverer now beginning to know him as holy and near and as one who speaks. And he remains that for us today.
The reading this morning is from Deuteronomy 1, verses 3 to 8. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses proclaimed to the Israelites that all that the Lord had commanded him concerning them. This was after he had defeated Sihon, king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon, and at Edrei had defeated Og, king of Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth. East of the Jordan, in the territory of Moab, Moses began to expound this law, saying, "The Lord our God said to us at Horeb, 'You have stayed long enough at this mountain. Break camp and advance into the hill country of the Amorites. Go to all the neighbouring people in the Arabah, in the mountains, in the western foothills, in the Negev, and along the coast, to the land of the Canaanites, and to Lebanon, as far as the great river, the Euphrates. See, I have given you this land. Go in and take possession of the land the Lord swore he would give to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac and Jacob, and to their descendants after them.'"
When God speaks those words to his people, "You've stayed long enough at this mountain," he's not speaking into a moment of failure. He's speaking into a moment of faithfulness. And I'm trying to illustrate that if we think of this as correction, we'll instinctively put our walls up, won't we? We'll be like, "Whew, I'm not doing that." Well, you might if you're anything like me. But if we begin to hear it as an invitation, something in us starts to lean in. We want to hear a bit more. We're a bit interested in what's going on. Because Horeb, it wasn't a mistake in their journey. It wasn't a delay. It wasn't a place they drifted into by accident. It was a place that God himself had led them to. And everything that happened there was both necessary and good. And at Horeb, a people who had only ever known slavery began to learn what it means to live as God's people. Their whole identity was reshaped, not around survival anymore, but around calling. They learned how to worship, how to order their lives, how to listen for the voice of God and to respond to it. Horeb was a place of shaping and nurturing. And what had once been chaotic began to take a form that wasn't forced on them by control, but came about by relationship with God. This is where God gives them the law, isn't it? And it's not as a restriction placed upon their lives, but as a way of forming them into the people who can live differently in the world. And it's here that they begin to understand what it means to belong to God. Everything that comes after depends on what happens here. And so for a long time, this mountain is exactly where they're meant to be. It's a place of encounter and grounding and of deep formation, and without it, they would not be ready for what lies ahead. But then there comes a moment when God speaks. And the tone of his word is quite striking in its simplicity. You have stayed long enough. He doesn't say you've done something wrong. He doesn't say you've failed. He simply says you've stayed long enough. And it means, I think, to me, that it's entirely possible to be in a place that God has led you to receive everything that he has for you in that place. And yet, to stay there longer than perhaps you're meant to remain there beyond the point that God intends for you. And that's a far more subtle thing to discern, isn't it? Because if Horeb had been a place of struggle, or if it had been awful there, they'd have been totally ready to leave, wouldn't they? They'd have been well up for it. If it had been uncomfortable, they would have been eager to move on. But Horeb was a rich place. A presence of God was there with them. It was full of meaning and full of formation. And it's precisely into that moment when God says, okay, come on, let's go. And the most difficult places to move on from are the ones, not that have failed us, but the ones that have formed us and shaped us. Places where God meets us and something deep began. And yet even there, God says, it's time to go. And when you see that pattern unfolding, you realise that it's not just unique to this moment in Deuteronomy. In fact, it runs all the way through the story of Scripture. Abraham, he's called to leave, isn't he? Somewhere that was really familiar, and he's called to step in something that's not even yet visible to him. The people of Israel, they're led through the wilderness, not as an end in itself, but as a preparation for a promise. And the early church, they're vibrant and devoted in Jerusalem. And they're eventually scattered. But it's in that scattering that the gospel begins to move and gain momentum and grow legs. And now it's here today with us. All because they were willing to move beyond what previously felt like the centre of everything. Again and again, God forms his people in a place and then he calls them beyond that place. Not because the place was wrong, but because it was never meant to be everything. And this is where the question becomes a little more personal for us, I think. A little more searching. Because it's one of those things to see a pattern in Scripture, and it's another thing to recognise how easily it can echo in our own lives. It's quite possible, quietly and almost without noticing it, to begin to settle into what has already been built, rather than continuing to be shaped by the God who built it with us. It's possible for something that began in dependence on God to gradually become sustained by familiarity instead. Nothing necessarily breaks, nothing necessarily goes wrong. In many ways, things can continue to be healthy and steady and even fruitful. And yet underneath, something begins to shift. Their sense of urgency softens a little. The depth of hunger becomes less sharp. The passion for the mission wanes a bit. The expectation that God will move and speak and lead or stretch us begins to settle into something a bit more predictable, more contained. Not gone, but quieter. And I think that's why this moment at Horeb is so interesting, because God doesn't wait for things to fall apart before he speaks. He speaks while things are still good, while formation is still taking place, while foundations are strong, and he gently calls his people forward. He's calling you forward. Not to abandon what has been built, but to move beyond it now. We're coming to the end of this 5-year plan that we had, and we've seen so much fulfillment, but what's next? And I believe what he's saying to us at this time is about depth and the kind of people we're becoming as we move forward. Because what lies ahead for Israel is not less demanding than Horeb. It's more demanding than that ever was. And it will require courage and trust and obedience and a kind of faith that cannot be sustained by structure alone. What they've received at the mountain will need to be carried into a very different kind of landscape. The church of today finds itself in a very different landscape than the one that it was in 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years ago. And we have to think beyond those patterns. We have to look and see what God is doing now. Because what lies ahead for us just as it was for Israel, is not less demanding. It will be more demanding. And our faith will need to be stronger than it has ever been before in order for us to step into what God has for us. And I'm sure in the same way there will be moments in the life of the church where what has been built matters deeply, but also quietly exposes the need for something deeper still. Over these past years, we've given ourselves fully to building this church well, becoming this community hub, a beacon of hope in this community again. We've created space for relationships, strengthened our leadership. We've even rewritten the Constitution. We've stepped into new things and shaped something that is real and meaningful, and those are good things. It's right to recognise God's work among us. But what he has built so practically well requires something more spiritually from us. Deeper roots, greater dependence, and a renewed openness to the presence and leading of God. Because if we remain at the level of what has already been built, we may well find that it's not enough to carry us into what God has for us next. So the question for us in this season isn't what we're going to do next. It's who are we becoming? Are we becoming a people of deeper prayer, or simply a people who know how to organise well? Are we becoming a people who listen carefully for the voice of God, or a people who have learned how to sustain what we've got? Are we becoming a people whose hunger for God is growing, or are we quietly settling for what already feels good? Because it's entirely possible to reach a place where everything looks healthy and quietly decide without saying it out loud, actually that's enough. And the moment we do that, the climb stops. Not because God has told us to stop, but because we have decided to stop. And yet, the invitation remains the same with God as it was for the Israelites for us today. Turn and take your journey. Not away from what has been built, but into what is still ahead. Move out from where you are. So what does that look like for us? What does it look like? Well, if this is a spiritual movement and not a physical one, then it won't show up where we go, it will show up how we live. It will show up in the decisions that we make about how we relate to God and to each other, particularly when no one else is watching. It will show up in the places where we realise, if we're honest, that we've settled into something that works but doesn't stretch us. And in practice, it begins quietly, in quite ordinary ways. It begins when prayer stops being something that we do in the moment, but becomes something that we deliberately make space for. Not because we're meant to, but because we recognise that we can't carry on doing what God is calling us to do without him. It'll begin when we stop relying on our own strength and leaning on our own understanding, and we press into what God is saying. And it might even look like stepping into something that just maybe feels a little bit beyond what we're used to. Because this is how we break camp. Not by announcing it, but by refusing to keep living at the same level. And this is how we take possession. Not by striving, but by trusting in what God has for us and claiming it. And when you begin to see it like that, it becomes much harder to keep this at a distance. Because it's no longer about a future vision or version of our faith. It's about this week. It's about today. It's about this moment. It's about whether actually anything will shift in how we live with God from here. Because you can hear my sermon. You can even say to me at the door, fantastic message this morning, Ali. Thanks so much. Really, really good. But if you do nothing with it, what was the point? We could recognize the mountain and still remain there. Recently, I went on a bit of girls' trip to Scotland. And we did loads of walking. Hopefully this will work. Here we go. You can see that's us at the beginning of climbing Ben Ann. And we were layered up for Scotland. We thought it was going to be freezing, and it turned out to be boiling. So we were like delayering as we went up the hill. And it was quite steep to begin with, and it hadn't really registered in my mind that it was 2 hours away from the summit at this point. And I could have chosen to just lay at the bottom and wait for them all to get back and let them go on the walk on their own. But together we kept going, no matter how hard it was. The terrain was really steep. Honestly, it felt like that at points until we reached the summit. It looks like we're standing on water, but we're not. It's right up in the clouds. Amazing. The view halfway up was awesome, but it was nothing like that. We would never have seen that without getting all the way to the top. We could have stopped halfway. God is inviting us to build something here, and we can stop where we are if we choose to. But if we do that, we'll miss all that he has for us. So I ask you to ask yourself this question: where is one place that you know that you have settled? And what would it look like to step beyond it today? Because we haven't come this far to only come this far.